the logic is the same. A sort of division of the world into the dark and the light, good and evil and so on. How and why this all happened?
We were a bit naive.
Was it naivety or was it structural?
I'm very delighted to see you here. First of all, I have read some of your books. One of them is very interesting, The Frontline Ukraine, that describes a genesis of the events, what is very important since '91. I will say that it is not much I do not agree with.
I mean, the book tries to put the events in Ukraine and in the larger context. Two major elements, the failure to establish an inclusive and equitable European security system after the end of the Cold War, but also the larger question of since 1945, with the first Cold War and then a Cold Peace and then a second Cold War from 2014, how and why this all happened. We failed after the end of the Second World War with the Grand Alliance of the Soviet Union and, of course, US and United Kingdom in very close relations. Even in the room where we're sitting now, the Soviet ambassador Ivan Maisky met Churchill many times.
Absolutely.
And there was a sign of the possibility of an alliance. After 1945, how we very quickly descended into Cold War situation. Was it avoidable?
Hardly, I do believe, because the current stage, which some are calling as a Cold War, which I'm not very supportive, is based on contradictions which are historical, situational, of course. Then it is interesting qualification that you have given in your book. It is contradiction between monism and pluralism in Ukraine and all that sort. The first Cold War has been based on ideological differences, Marxist and Leninist ideology, which in fact has as a foundation the destruction of the West. The frontiers that has been established in '45, they were considered as temporarily, and as a revolution should go further, that was clear, and there were grounds for that. You know that in Italy and in France at that time, communists were a dominating force, and even here in Britain, I will say the Communist Party until a number of years was one of the major driver of politics. So this is different situation.
But the Soviet Union was a founder member of the United Nations, and it worked remarkably effectively in the sense of establishing and working on the Charter of the United Nations and other documents. And then we have international politics, which is, as it were, a second level, a second type of domain. And while you describe absolutely accurately the ideological conflicts, the political conflicts after the war, yet we have this common commitment to the Charter idea, as opposed to day-to-day politics. In the first Cold War, the battle between, as this ideological struggle you talked about, took place within the Charter system. The danger today is that it's actually even about the United Nations and the Charter system, very marginalized, and that it's, if you like, the contest is worse today than even it was earlier in a strange sort of way.
In that sense, I have to agree with you, because after the Second World War, we did have still strong relationship between US, Russia, France, Great Britain inside the United Nations, and acute international questions could be resolved through the Security Council, through the United Nations, and actually there was serious drive towards the disarmament in early 70s and later on, when we have come to a certain age with the United States, after which it could be a nuclear disaster, of course. And besides, we didn't have other system than that one. If you recall, then we did have three voices in the General Assembly, because Belarus and Ukraine, on insistence by Stalin, in fact, he as far as I recall, he did wanted 5 republics.
In fact, he wanted the whole lot, I think 16 at that time.
All 16.
Plus 17 in the Soviet Union.
But he was one of the author, of course, of the United Nations, and it was very functional for some time. Later on, of course, we did have serious disagreements about Korea. But what we do have at the moment, it is, of course, a serious confrontation. Security Council is paralyzed. We have one country as Russia, and against us, France, US, Britain as permanent members. Sometimes we are together with China, but of course China has its own policy. I cannot say that we are 100% together. Still, we are on one side. That is why we are calling for certain reforms in the United Nations that will include representatives of Global South, of Africa, of Latin America. These discussions are continuing, but given the differences in opinion, since these trio of Western countries, they advocate for Germany and Japan. For us, it is just an overweight of Western countries, Western country politics. This will not work.
Our country is part of what I call the political West, which
Absolutely.
includes
political
Japan.
West. Yes, political West.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes without saying that India should be one permanent member.
Yeah, discussions are going on, and it seems to be endless, so it's a long story.
It's a mechanism to make this change. I think everybody accepts that the Security Council should change, but there's no way to achieve that change at the moment because of lack of consensus.
Another important thing is that, of course, UN cannot take care of all conflicts in the world. We do need regional organizations for this, which do exist. ASEAN exists in the East. We tried to make a regional organization from the OSCE, and in the beginning it was functioning in terms of conflicts. But later on, unfortunately, West has turned it into a certain instrument for human rights only. So that was our big problem. So it cannot work as a regional organization for Europe in a conflict resolution.
That's good. At the end of the Cold War, there were plans and ideas for the OSCE to become the major security body. Instead of NATO, this would have been the foundation, and that would have set Europe on a very different path than the one in which we find ourselves today. Was there a chance in the early 1990s to make this important, and why didn't it happen? Was it simply Washington's insistence that NATO should be the main security body? Why didn't the Europeans argue more strongly for their own position? What we really needed after the end of the Cold War was a genuine pan-European, a continental system of security all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Not anti-American, of course, but post-American. Was there a chance, and why did it fail?
We worked very seriously on this issue after Helsinki Charter has been signed in 1975, and then Paris document in 1990. We were a bit naive. We were certain that we can establish partnerships with NATO and the European Union. Participation in NATO will change the nature of NATO, and that was the main argument of the United States when they declined this hypothetical proposal that we can be, although we never believed into that. Primakov, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, he initially was certain that the only thing they can do is just to put us in the queue for a very long time. In the 90s, we were coming closer in that sense with the Americans, and it was intensive years of cooperation with the institutions as well. But first shock was, of course, the bombardment of Belgrade. The second shock was war in Iraq, 2003. And after that, we started to understand that our interests, they are not going like that, but they are going started to decline.
So the problem was the failure to institutionalize that relationship with NATO. You have the 1997 Permanent Joint Accords and 2002 the NATO-Russia Council. But all of this was, in a sense, a way of keeping Russia quiet. We needed an institutional, structural change at the end of the Cold War, and this didn't happen. All that happened effectively was the expansion of the institutions of the political West, NATO, OSCE, as you say, basically gutted of its transformative potential. And instead of which, Russia was left, out with its own vision of how the post-Cold War security order should look like. Meanwhile, the political West establishes it on the framework of what you could call hegemonic internationalism or democratic internationalism, its own vision of how the world should be organized. Everybody in Moscow understood the security dilemma. When Vladimir Putin came in, in the year 2000, one of the first things he did was try to solve this dilemma. He said, he spoke with Bill Clinton, and he's mentioned this a few times, we have to sort this out. Can Russia, if not join, some sort of substantive partnership? And when NATO was enlarging in the 1990s, when it first enlarged, even Zbigniew Brzezinski, the famous grand chessboard man, said, of course, he was a partisan, very passionate in favor of NATO enlargement. But even he, in 1997, in his grand chessboard book, said, of course, we need an overarching security framework with Russia. And also William Burns, who's now head of CIA, who was the US ambassador to Moscow as well, who understood the things in those days, said there has to be this framework. Ultimately, yes, naivety. Was there a way in which some sort of, you could have broken the logjam, if you like, on institutional change to actually transform European security? Because ultimately, we began with the war and the conflict over Ukraine. Ultimately, we have identified for 30 years there was an issue and the failure to resolve it. So was it naivety or was it structural?
Initially, as you know, the whole idea on which NATO was based is to keep Germans down, US in, and Russia out.
Soviet Union out.
Soviet Union at that time. We have created with NATO agreements, a number of participation in certain committees in which we can do things together. But all this was not central to NATO activity. Ecology, conversion of war industry into civilian industry, some exercises, terrorism and all that things, but the central thing is planning of resources or military plans. We will never have been brought in. You know that in NATO everything has been mostly decided by Big Four. It is US, UK, France and Germany. On the surface, NATO-Russia Council, of course, was a good thing, but it was still on the periphery of the major NATO activity. The issue was when Americans put themselves a question, what is NATO? Is it a conference hall or a military alliance? But the choice was for a military alliance. And military alliance against whom? Against us, since we started to get out of this influence and we started to understand more and more that this partnership is in vain, it does not work. Similar things were developing on the side of the European Union. Because we were closer and closer initially, and we were striking more and more agreements with them. But finally, when we started to speak about the common joint peacekeeping operations, joint serious economical projects, and finally Putin discussed with Barroso an option of the free trade zone. Barroso said at that time, no free trade zone with Russia. Ukraine, Moldavia, Georgia, priorities, Eastern Partnership.
I mean, two things on NATO, that it remained a defense alliance rather than a fully transformed collective security body. This was a failure in the 1930s when the Soviet Union also tried to establish collective security. That failed. And in a strange sort of way, we've repeated today the inability to establish a genuinely collective security body for all of Europe. For different reasons in the 1930s. Today, of course, because you've got a huge external actor to which you've alluded, the United States and, of course, the NATO alliance and the political West, is a way of managing, for Washington, alliance relationships with its like-minded partners. And, of course, Russia, if Russia joined, then, of course, it would decenter Washington for a start, and it would also transform the very nature from defensive to collective security. And that was, a catastrophic failure. What puzzles me sometimes is why the European, you talk about the Big Four, but what about France, Germany? Of course, in France you have this long Gaullist tradition. And of course that seems to have disappeared. This vision of pan-continental unity, again, not anti-American, but post-American. Okay, we are partners, equal partners. That's another failure, isn't it?
In being members of NATO, there are advantages for many countries. Most of all is that they do not need to spend so much on defense all around you. They are choosing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tasks. For instance, Belgium has a task on the sea. The Netherlands, they have an air task. But they do not create the effective defense all around them. So it is minimizing defense spending. This is one thing. The second thing is that all East European countries couldn't do themselves reduction of the army and reduction of the general staff, number of generals. That was the major problem. It is only under NATO supervision it could have been done. But more and more they have started to subordinate towards NATO collective policy, and this collective policy has been dictated by the United States. Countries like France and Germany, they were losing their traditional realistic views towards the relationship with Russia, with Soviet Union, and more subordinating to the views dictated from Washington. It's President Putin he told in one of his press conferences about Syria, when President of France has come to Moscow, they fully agree about what they are going to do in Syria. Then President of France has gone to Washington and totally changed his position about common action with us. So.
That's exactly why I use this concept of, Russians like to talk of the collective West,
Yes.
and I talk of the political West to give it more historical and particular grounding, because ultimately it's designed to ensure alliance cohesion, which of course, and coordination. And what is interesting is the fact that all these countries within the collective political West are willing to accept US leadership. And of course, after enlargement of NATO and indeed the European Union, we have what was called in the Iraq War the new Europe against the old European states. And now the Eastern European view, the new European view, has completely transformed the very nature both of the European Union and, of course, of NATO. And you mentioned you didn't like the term Cold War to describe contemporary politics
for today. For now, yes.
Yes. Why not? Why do you think? Because a Cold War, in my view, is a style of politics. It's a style of politics which doesn't like dialogue for a start. Even in the first Cold War, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis or the diplomatic relations. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dobrynin, who was the Soviet ambassador in Washington, was meeting Robert Kennedy, and this was normal. Second Cold War, it's worse than the first. Because this idea, even our discussion today, will get a lot of criticism. Fact is that, how can you talk to Russians today? So Cold War is a style of politics which doesn't engage with dialogue. I mean, as I say, the second Cold War is intensification. It's the vilification of the enemy. It's no longer communism versus capitalism, but they talk of autocracy versus democracy. But the logic is the same. A sort of division of the world into the dark and the light, good and bad, good and evil, and so on. I was skeptical in using the word Cold War because it misapplies it. It suggests it's a continuation of the First Cold War. But if we talk about it as a style of politics, then it makes sense.
I think that this first Cold War that ended basically in late 70s or early 80s, we can say, was based on ideology, as you say, communist and or socialist and capitalist, and contradictions were absolutely absolute, I would say. They cannot be, there is no reciprocity in it. Now we do not have this contradiction. We are building capitalism ourselves. It is in Russia, it is based, probably it has more state influence than in the other countries. And of course, this label of authoritarianism, it is not applicable to us. It is also a way of democracy. Democracy has many faces. In my view, the things are not that bad as during the first phase of the Cold War, because we still have common interests. People now is different. People will not accept in Europe as well as in Russia the real war. What we do have in Ukraine, it's a conflict, as you are saying, between monism and pluralism. That is true. It is much more serious, and it has gone out of all controls. Both Russian and Western control. It is now what we do have in impersonation of Zelensky. It's a figure that he can live only in conditions of this war, because otherwise he will be toppled and he will have to leave. But this is repairable on some conditions. I'm not sure when it will happen. Either it will happen this winter or next summer, or it is, but it's still, goals are clear. And during the Cold War, the idea was a total destruction of each other. So that's, of course.
Under Khrushchev, there was peaceful coexistence, which accepted that you could have different systems working, well, not together, but don't necessarily, that war was not inevitable. Today, people are more concerned that we're closer to the Third World War. You're absolutely right. There's many common interests, not just nuclear disarmament, biological and chemical weapons, and environmental issues. There's so much common challenges between Russia and the political countries of the West, but there's no dialogue. That's why I say it's worse than the First Cold War. In the Second Cold War, dialogue has completely gone. At the end of the First Cold War, we had in the Soviet Union the new political thinking, which was really genuinely attempt to say, look, the Western powers, according to Marxist-Leninist dogma, were inevitably militaristic and violent, aggressive, imperialistic. And Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, during Perestroika, in the late 1980s, said, we don't need this Cold War. Remember what Georgy Arbatov said to the Washington. We're going to do something terrible to you. We're going to remove the image of the enemy. So this Gorbachevian vision, I mean, we talk about naivety, of course, there were failings in all of that. His view wasn't just his personal view. It was a Soviet system had matured that this ideological conflict would no longer need to take these, this bloc-type politics facing each other. His famous speech, and this is why I go on about the United Nations, in December 1988, which effectively put an end to the Cold War. When he put an end to the Cold War, Gorbachev, it was not a capitulation to the West. The commitment was, we don't need this Cold War. Let's work together within the United Nations. That is the agenda, ultimately, which is perhaps a pathway today out from this present conflict. Not naivety, but a systemic vision of how to move beyond it.
I wouldn't say naive, but it's a bit idealistic representation of situation, because the peaceful coexistence has derived from the thing that the Soviet Union, of course, was very slow in development economically. And it was losing terrain to the United States and Western world, and it was more and more understandable. 88, 89, I was part of the Russian negotiations team in START and INF treaties. 90% of industry was working for war, and only 10% was producing things for people, for civilians,
the consumer
and everything.
economy.
Of course, yes. The gap in this technological and economical development was wider and wider. And I do believe that the main driving factor for Gorbachev to make these concessions concerning withdrawal of forces from Germany, of course, necessity of disarmament, and even peaceful coexistence theory, it was due to these factors. Initially, in early 60s, of course, we were very quick in developing space, orbital things, nuclear things, lots advancing. But then, unfortunately, the socialist system as such, it didn't manage the competition with the capitalist system in the West. And it was more clear and clear this disadvantage could lead us to disaster. When Reagan has proclaimed his Star Wars, and we started to compete on that in pouring all cement factories into deserts and all that stuff, that was inevitable.
The Soviet economy could have survived. I mean, it was limping along, but it wasn't given a chance. It had no time. And of course, then you had the domestic insurgency of Yeltsin, which undermined the Gorbachevian strategy. And of course, the inability and refusal of George Bush Sr. to make any fundamental concessions. You talked before about the Helsinki Final Act. And the problem with all these acts, and the Paris, the November 1990, and of course the Istanbul Declaration 99, Astana 2010, all of them contain within them two ideas: that security has to be indivisible and everything else. And at the same time, they talk about the free choice, the country's ability to have free choice. So there's two models of international politics. So we have this sort of systemic, structural conflict going on all the way through. And how to overcome it is that we will say, well, look, we need to have a reset of international politics to say, look, these ideas are not ultimately incompatible, the Helsinki Final Act, with, if we could institutionalize it, and that's been the failure all the way through from 1989, 88 onwards to today. So I wonder whether the way forwards would be to say, look, we need perhaps a new European security, a conference, a Helsinki 2, not Yalta 2, because that's got too much baggage with it, and Yalta-Potsdam system would be, again, spheres of influence and so on, which we don't really need. We need respect for spheres of security, not spheres of influence in the old-fashioned Yalta-Potsdam manner. But Helsinki, the spirit of Helsinki, I mean, obviously, a grand bargain, a European conference, is that a possible way forwards?
Yes, of course. But every result of this conference, it was a matter of compromise, as well as Helsinki Decalogue of Principles, because it contains also the sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the same time, it contains, as a principle number 7,
self-determination.
Self-determination, yes. For the Soviet Union, it was number 1 principle of sovereignty, and the territorial integrity was most important at that time. Yeah. So now it is different. So things are changing, I mean. And when we are speaking about an option of settling with Ukraine further on, we are also talking about two-tier system. One is the settlement with Ukraine, and the second, it's of course will be a new we are saying now Eurasian order, Eurasian structure, but we do not deny a participation of Western Europe and Europe as a whole in this system if they will agree. This is a kind of coming back to the ground roots of the principles, because serious politicians, they do remember them. Of course, now they are trying to forget about the genesis of it, the basics of the real international law. My conviction is sooner or later we will have to go back to basics and to blow the dust from the Paris Charter, from the Helsinki Agreement, and we will live in accordance with its principles, because we have no others.
No, absolutely, there's no alternative. Would you go along then with the view that Russia today is becoming post-Western Russia, that it's looking to the east, it's established global south? Post-Western is one thing, that it hasn't worked. NATO, OSCE, all of that has gone for the immediate future and perhaps this generation. But Russia is perhaps even more, not just post-Western, but post-European, that its fate now, this, as Sergei Karaganov, the well-known commentator, argues, this 500-year history, 300 years from Peter the Great, of Russia always trying to integrate with the West, with Europe, with its model, always chasing a model elsewhere. Even Marxism-Leninism, of course, came from the West. So is it time now for Russia to say, look, this is over, we'll work with our partners, you've mentioned them, China, India, other countries, many in Africa, very close relations. But still, Russia is a European country. How do we square that circle?
You know that for hundreds of years we did have in Russia discussions between Westerners and Easterners.
The Slavophiles versus the Westerners.
Our veterans of diplomacy, they recall a discussion in Politburo of the Communist Party, what kind of values do we have? And soon after Helsinki Decalogue has been approved, there was a decision by Politburo that we have European values. Of course, they are Europeans. European principles, European style of life across the country. Although more people are turning now to Chinese because it's a wide market right now, but still, of course, there is no idea to abandon all of that. But we have to resolve these differences. Otherwise, it will be the war will be much bloodier with involvement of much more countries. You know, your genesis here, it has shown how we did come to this moment, and this is important because. Even here in London, most of the politicians, they are starting this war from February 2022, which is not true. And no one would like to recall what has happened much earlier, in early 2000s. That is why we are trying to involve them into discussions of the early events, saying Georgia, 2008, August 2008, and all of that, what has happened in Ukraine, during all these changes of the government from Yushchenko until further on, that gives you the real picture how we did arrive to these difficulties and to this point. Without an understanding the history and without understanding genesis, you cannot do the proper conclusions, and this will bring us into a real disaster. So.